Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really, really disturbing case. The story of Terry Blair. He was a serial killer in Kansas City back in the early 2000s. But what makes this case even more messed up is that he wasn't the only one in his family who was like really violent. It's like his whole family tree is full of criminals.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, right? I mean, you look at this family and it really makes you wonder, like, was Terry Blair like destined to become a killer?
Yeah.
Or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, for sure. It seems like there's a lot more to this story than just one guy's crimes. To get everyone up to speed, let's start with the basics. Terry Blair was convicted of killing 7 women, but investigators think there might be more victims out there.
Right. And the way he went about it, it's like extra creepy. He would often call 911 himself and like anonymously report where some of his victims were. I mean, some people say he did that because he wanted like attention. He wanted to be known for these horrible things he did.
So he wasn't like just satisfied with the killings themselves. He wanted to like make sure everyone knew it was him.
Man, that's really disturbing.
Hmm.
But before we get too deep into Terry Blair himself, let's take a step back and look at this like crazy family history of violence.
Oh.
Where do we even like start with this?
Well, we could start with Blair's mom, Janice. Back in '78, she killed her common law husband. She ended up taking an Alford plea, which means she didn't say she was guilty, but she knew they had enough evidence to convict her.
Wow, so even when Blair was a kid, there was already like violence in his home.
And it didn't stop there. His brother, Walter, he was executed in '93 for killing 2 people, and one of those murders was a contract killing, which kind of shows you how little they valued human life.
I feel like violence was just like the answer to everything, like a horrible family tradition or something. And it wasn't just the brothers, right? Their sister, Ornetta, was also involved in like multiple murders. Exactly. Ornetta's husband actually spent 12 years in prison for killing a guy named James Bell, and she was involved in that too. And then a few years later, she killed her own boyfriend.
It's uh it's hard to believe that a family could get so used to all that violence. And on top of that, 2 more brothers, Clifford and Daniel, they also had their fair share of trouble with the law. Violence, drugs, the whole 9 yards. It's like a whole family tree of crime.
And the messed up thing is, this pattern just like continued with the next generation.
Mhm.
Blair's nephews, Diamond and William, they also kept up this tradition of violence. Diamond's actually doing multiple life sentences for murder and other violent crimes, and William's got a ton of charges for armed robberies.
Man, it makes you wonder if it's like more than just their environment. Was there something like in their genes that made them more likely to be violent?
Well, that's a really tough question. Scientists are still trying to figure that out. Genes might be part of it, but it's not like a simple cause and effect. It's probably a combination of their genes and their environment. Like maybe they were born with a tendency toward violence and then growing up around so much violence just like made it worse.
So you're saying that, like, because Terry Blair grew up surrounded by all this violence, it made him more likely to become a killer himself.
Well, there's a theory called the cycle of violence, and it definitely suggests that could be the case. The idea is that if you like see or experience violence as a kid, you're more likely to be violent when you grow up.
That's a scary thought. If all you know is violence, then that's what you turn to when you have a problem, right? But we got to remember that Terry Blair was already a convicted murderer before all these other killings, right?
That's right. Back in 1982, he killed Angela Monroe. She was the mother of 2 of his kids. He got 25 years for that.
So he was out on parole when he committed all those murders in the 2000s. That makes you think about the system. Like, did it fail? Did it not rehabilitate him? Did it not prevent all those other murders?
Yeah, it definitely makes you question things, doesn't it? But before we get into those later murders, maybe we should take a closer look at that 1982 case. What happened with Angela Monroe?
Yeah, you're right. Let's go back in time and see what we can learn about Terry Blair from that 1982 murder.
So yeah, back in 82, Terry Blair was convicted of killing Angela Monroe. They found her in their apartment. She had been strangled to death. And, well, Blair was the main suspect right from the start.
And didn't they have kids together? It just makes this whole thing even more awful.
They did, yeah. 2 young kids. It's just heartbreaking. Losing their mom like that and then their dad goes to prison for it. Just unimaginable.
It really makes you wonder, like what happens to kids who go through something like that? And I mean, even for Blair himself, could that kind of trauma, that early violence, could that have like shaped him, maybe made him more likely to be violent himself?
It's tough to say for sure, but Like we were talking about before, the cycle of violence theory. It kind of suggests that's possible. And with Blair, it wasn't just violence at home. His brother Walter, remember, he was executed for murder. Seeing something like that could really mess someone up.
It's hard to even imagine how someone could deal with that,
Mhm.
let alone go on to do the same thing themselves. Did Blair ever talk about his brother's execution, like how it affected him?
Not really. Blair never really opened up about his personal life or like what motivated him. He almost never talked to the press. And even during his trials, he was always really closed off, never confessed to anything.
So we're left with all these questions. We see this pattern of violence, but we don't know why. Did any of the sources we looked at say anything about Blair's time in prison? Like, did he try to get better? Did he participate in any programs?
Not really, no. But he did get out on parole after 21 years. So the parole board must have thought he had changed, that he wasn't a danger anymore.
And then just a few years later, he starts killing again. It makes you question the whole parole system. How can they be sure someone won't, do it again?
It's a big question, for sure. And there's no easy answer. Figuring out if someone's going to reoffend, it's not a perfect science.
Oh.
It's complicated. You got to look at the crime, their mental state, how they acted in prison, their support system outside. There's just so much to consider.
And with Blair, well, they got it wrong. Tragically wrong. Let's move on to the murders that got him convicted. You mentioned those 911 calls. Those are really creepy. Can you tell us more about those? Like, what did he say? How did the police react?
They were quick calls,
Yeah.
just giving an address and maybe saying something was wrong. Sometimes he even told them where to find the bodies. Can you imagine being the person who took those calls, putting it all together?
It's awful. Did the police think it was the same person making all those calls?
At first, no. The phone was stolen, and he only used it for those 911 calls, so it was hard to trace back to Blair.
So how'd they finally figure out it was him? Was it just the phone records?
The phone records helped, yeah. The cell tower data put the calls near Blair's house, but the big break was the DNA. They found Blair's DNA on one of the victims, Shalia McKenzie.
So even though he tried to be all sneaky with the stolen phone, he messed up and left some evidence. It seems like he was being careful, but also like reckless at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of serial killers, they're like that. Really careful planners, but then also impulsive. Like they get a thrill from the killing and from trying to outsmart the cops.
And the 911 calls, any idea why he made those? Was he just trying to get attention like some people think?
Hard to say, really. Blair never told anyone why he did anything. But those calls, they do make it seem like he wanted, I don't know, like he wanted to be a part of it all. Like he wanted credit for this whole awful thing.
That's a pretty scary thought. But at the end of the day, it's all just speculation, Sari. Without Blair telling us, we're just guessing, trying to understand him based on what little we know about how people act.
Exactly. We can't pretend to know what was going on in his head. But we can look at the evidence and try to, I don't know, try to make some sense of it all. And one thing that's really weird is that even though they had all this evidence against him, Blair never admitted to anything.
So even when he was facing like a life sentence, he still said he was innocent. What do you think about that?
It's a tough one. Was he just desperate, trying to control the story? Or did he really believe he didn't do it?
Tough to say. But it just adds to the mystery of Terry Blair. So let's talk about the trial. What happened? What was the verdict? So they charged Blair with like 8 murders, right? First-degree murder. But then they dropped a couple of those charges. But still, he was looking at life in prison. What did the prosecution focus on? Like, what was the strategy?
Well, they used everything, the forensic evidence, the cell phone records, people who testified. They basically said, look, he killed all these women. He did it the same way every time, and we found his DNA on one of them. He's guilty.
But Blair kept saying he didn't do it, right, through the whole trial. Did his lawyers have, like, a different explanation for all the evidence?
Oh, yeah, they did. They said, well, most of that evidence doesn't really prove anything. And they didn't have a motive. They said that Blair had been with some of those women before,
Yeah.
in relationships. So his DNA could have been there for, normal reasons.
So it was like he said, she said kind of thing.
Not really, no. The prosecution, they had a good story, It all fit together. And they did something kind of interesting that I think helped them win the case.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
They said they wouldn't go for the death penalty if Blair agreed to, skip the jury trial. So the judge decided the verdict, not a jury.
Wow. That's a big risk, right? Why would they give up the death penalty in a case like this?
Probably because they thought they had a better chance with the judge. Maybe a jury would be more emotional. But a judge, they thought he'd just look at the facts.
And it worked.
Yeah. The judge found Blair guilty of 6 murders, 6 life sentences,
Yeah.
no parole. He was going to die in prison.
And that's what happened. He died last year, 2024. Never admitted to anything, never explained why he did it. It's got to be hard for the families, No real closure.
Yeah. It's a reminder that sometimes, even when you get justice, you don't get answers. We'll probably never know why Blair did what he did, but maybe we can learn from this case. Maybe we can stop something like this from happening again.
That's a good point. So we've talked about Blair's crimes, his crazy family, how he ended up in prison, but this whole thing brings up some big questions, doesn't it? About evil, about violence, about how well the justice system works.
Yeah, for sure. The Blair family, they're kind of like an example of what's wrong with society.
Yeah.
Poverty, trauma, mental health, all these things can lead to crime.
And those aren't just like words. They're real problems. The Blair family proves that. So what can we do? What can people do about this?
Well, first, we got to admit these problems exist. They affect everyone, even if we don't see it. We
Right.
can help organizations that are fighting poverty. We can push for changes in the justice system. We can talk about mental health more openly.
Yeah. This deep dive, it's been dark, really dark, but it should make us want to do something to make things better. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope this has made you think. And maybe, just maybe, it'll make you want to go out there and make a difference.